out of your work, your most significant scholarship in his mind is when you came to work at Stanford. So what brought you to Stanford in 1982, where you became the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education?
Well, we had spent a couple of years earlier at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, kind of looking down off the hill at Stanford for a year, and had some good friends on the faculty. To be quite honest, two or three things happened simultaneously. One was that we had been at Michigan State for almost 20 years. And we had gotten the Institute for Research on Teaching. I mean, it had moved from being a kind of a place nobody paid attention to increasingly seen as the best place in the world for research on teaching and for teacher education. I mean, to this day, and I think it started at that time, when you look at the evaluations of schools of education, elementary teacher ed and secondary teacher ed, Michigan State's rated #1 in the country year after year after year. Deservedly. I mean, it became the center of that work. It was an exciting place. But at a certain level, I felt that it was, that I was being treated too well there. It was almost too, not too easy, but too comfortable. And, you know, Stanford was considered the very best place in the country in educational scholarship then. And they had just hired a new dean, Mike Atkin from the University of Illinois, who brought with him a very Big Ten public university perspective on the centrality of teacher education in a very researchy ed school. And teacher ed had almost been closed at Stanford a couple of years before that. Why do we need teacher ed? I mean, it was that kind of, and my view is you couldn't do responsible research in this area without having an ongoing teacher education program that would be both a moral exemplar of what you were doing and a laboratory. Anyway, Mike Atkin as dean turned that around, and he got them to post a position in this field, even though Nate Gage was still there doing research on teaching. And so I think it was a combination of these things. It was not the weather, though Michigan can be trying at times, but it wasn't the weather. It was the chance of coming to a very, very exciting place where, quite frankly, the quality of the senior faculty was so high that I was really just one of the guys. I mean, you say I came as the Charles Ducommun Professor. I didn't. The Ducommun Chair didn't exist in 1982.
Okay.
And there's a really interesting story there too, and that was that when I was recruited by Atkin, he offered me one of the endowed chairs. And I said, sure, that would be great. But then he called with great embarrassment about 2 months later and said, Lee, I don't know what to do because some of the senior faculty who were your biggest supporters about our recruiting you have expressed some discomfort with with having you come in one of these endowed. There were only 4 endowed chairs at Stanford at the time, and Cronbach was in one. Gage didn't have a chair yet, you know. And they said, because there are even more senior faculty here. I was only 44 when I came to Stanford. I think the notion was, you know, you ought to get in line. And he said, but I promised you this chair and I will stick to my guns. I said, absolutely not. They're right. I've got to get in line. This is not a time to come that way. And I forget who the chair went to. It might have gone to Gage. I just don't remember. And as it turned out, it was a wise thing to do. In 1989, the Ducommun Chair was created with a focus on teaching and teacher education from the preschool to the graduate school. And in many ways, Donald Kenney, who was the president then, worked with a donor and built the design of the chair around my work. That was the right chair. That was the right one. And it only happened in '89, and it was exactly right. And I think you know who succeeded me in that chair. Linda Darling Hammond.
Sure.
So another example of a move that improves the quality of the chair. You know?
And during your tenure here at Stanford, what do you believe is your most significant impact in terms of research?
Well, I think the most significant impact in terms of research was the ongoing work on teacher knowledge. I mean, the stuff on teacher knowledge that, you know, there was work on how do you look at what teachers know, how do you teach that sort of thing so it becomes pedagogical content knowledge, and the kind of opening up the whole area of case methods and case literature, which was then so magnificently pursued by Judy Shulman in her work at Far West and now West Ed. I mean, there's been so much work now that continues to go on that deals with this intersection with the case method stuff. I mean, that's been, in terms of generativity, the most generative work I will ever do, probably. In terms of impact on practice and policy, the most important work was the work that led to the creation of the National Board. But the important thing to realize, and many people don't, they think that the National Board as this policy instrument, which now we're getting close to 100,000 National Board certified teachers in America, kind of came out of nowhere. It was this big idea, oh, let's get a National Board just like medicine. And then we did some research, and it flowed. For me anyway, it started with the work on medical problem solving that flowed into the Institute for Research on Teaching, that flowed into the teacher knowledge and pedagogical content knowledge work, and you see it all culminating in the National Board. The uses of simulation, the uses of multiple assessments because teaching is not one thing. I mean, all that stuff, the strong emphasis on reflection and analysis rather than only on behavior. I mean, all that flowed. So the National Board is certainly a practical impact. And what I didn't realize until a little bit later was that when we moved from the first version of the National Board, which was all using simulations, more the sort of stuff that David was doing subsequently on his work on teacher thinking, you know, using simulations of various kinds. We didn't like the fact, even though the simulations we used in the first phase of our work on teacher assessment were extraordinarily powerful, they were decontextualized. And we concluded that teaching is always about the context. It's always about who you're teaching, when and where, and we needed a form of assessment that would capture the context. And we came up with the notion of a teaching portfolio as an assessment. Now this is now in 1987, 88 is when we moved to the portfolio. So it's 23 years ago, 24 years ago. Everybody told us it would never work. It wasn't sufficiently controlled. It wasn't going to be scoreable. Teachers would cheat because they'd help each other on their portfolios. All of these, and you know, Mike Kirst predicted none of those innovations last anyway. Not only did the board make it as a portfolio-based assessment, one of the other practical things that it turns out to have legitimated was portfolios. Now, it's almost impossible to find a teacher education program anywhere that doesn't have a portfolio at the heart of it. And Howard Gardner said to me that it took our using portfolios for a teacher assessment method for his folks at Project Zero to get over the hump on the use of portfolios for the assessment of the kind of stuff that Howard and Ted Sizer were interested in. So I think in those terms, the theoretical work on content-specific pedagogy, PCK, was probably the most important and the lasting. In terms of practice and policy, it was probably the board, case methods, and portfolios.
And portfolios and assessment systems.
Yeah.
So given your work with the assessment systems, what are your opinions about America's current accountability and assessment systems?
Most of them are really awful. I think that, you know, here again, when I talked earlier about how sometimes you realize that your best big idea has really serious weaknesses. And if I had to look at the most retrospect, at the most serious weakness in the work that I did and encouraged and nurtured from the IRT right through the national board work. So now you're talking about a chunk of 15 years. My colleagues and I were so very good at attacking process product research that we threw out baby and bathwater together. We threw out general processes, which I now realize have a place, what have you, and focused on domain-specific ones primarily, though that wasn't the biggest issue. But we were so critical of the use of standardized achievement tests, which were the only measure being used to get at the product, that if you look at our work over those years and you look at how the National Board was designed, we threw out standardized achievement tests as an outcome measure, but we were slow to replace it with some other way of documenting and measuring impact on students. So if you look at the portfolios, almost every portfolio entry looks at student work. But it never occurred to us that people at the policy level wouldn't trust teacher evaluations of student work as an adequate measure of what students were learning. And so for a long time, I know I just was so oriented toward teacher knowledge and how it related to what teachers were able to do and how it related to particular aspects of student work, that I think I lost sight of the broader notions that policymakers were carrying around with them of student outcomes. Now, I still think the standardized achievement tests are a lousy measure. But it has taken us years, and we're still not there yet, to develop alternative measures that will earn the trust of the policymakers, who are often clueless about most of this stuff.
Sure.
But the fact is, that's our audience. So I am much more, you know, we just had a panel review the National Board work that Bob Lynn chaired, and Linda and I were both on it, and Lloyd Bond, and Rick Hess, and Doug Harris, an economist, trying to evaluate how the National Board could begin to incorporate more evidence of student learning into their portfolios. And the most important idea in the report is student learning is different from student achievement. Learning is a much broader and concept with many more facets to it, that if it gets reduced to student achievement and that gets reduced to standardized achievement tests, then you're a wreck. So, you know, I think the attempts now to develop more pluralistic assessment systems that come at this from different perspectives, that include ways of trying to document impact on student learning, are the way to go. I see very little of this going on right now. It's expensive. It is going to require going back to trusting teacher judgment more than we have in recent years. But then it also means really goosing up the quality of teacher education and professional development, so you make sure that teacher judgments are resting on sufficient grasp of the evidence about student learning so that it's worth trusting with more and more higher stakes evaluations.
Around this time, you also met Gary Fenstermacher, and he remembers a time that you, David Berliner, and he sat in a room at ARA for many hours dissecting the research on teaching. and this experience still ranks as one of the highlights of his academic career. He also cherishes the memories you have built over the last 3 years, during which you have written together, critiqued in print each other's work and live, gone to plays and musicals together, cruised the seas between Athens and Venice, been guests in one another's homes, ate large steaks, and drank fabulous and lousy wine together.
Both.
Joined your good friends Rich Shavelson and David Berliner and all of your remarkable spouses in celebrating one another's birthdays. All now doing this for 30 years. And there's always your Jewish jokes. Do tell one?
Tell one.
Tell one.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's I mean, there's so many, Audrey. But one of the ones I like best, which to this day I use in many of my talks, is the one about the aging Jewish school teacher in Poland who's sitting alone in his small house with his wife of many years, and he looks up from his books that he's studying, and he says, "You know, I've been thinking, Audrey," he said, "if I were the Tsar, I would actually be richer than the Tsar." And she says to him, "David, how could you possibly be richer than the Tsar? If you were the Tsar, you would be just as rich as the Tsar." And he said, no, I've really been thinking about this. If I were the Tsar, I could still do a little teaching on the side. So, I mean, that's a kind of, there's a sort of irony there,
Sure.
right? You know, the notion that...
And wisdom.
And for me, I think, you know, the reason I use that joke a lot strategically, especially in higher education situations, is that one of the ways in which universities have corrupted teaching is that they've conveyed the message that the real role of a university professor is to do research and to write. And then they do a little teaching on the side.
Sure.
And in fact, when you talk about the prestige of teaching, I think that gets communicated to society more generally. That teaching is something any of us could do. In fact, we had a little extra time, we could do a little teaching on the side.
Sure.
Nobody thinks they can do neurosurgery or archaeology on the side.
And these are things we can get bought out of as well.
Yeah, we get bought out of. We have a teaching load, and we have the privilege of doing research, and I think that's...
Even the load, the word alone.
Oh, sure.
Sure.
Oh, sure. The burden that we beasts carry.
Sure. Speaking of students, Suzanne Wilson.
Ah.
You mentored her. She was your doctoral student, and she says you have something with strong women, that you align with many strong women, including her and Pam Grossman and Pat Hutchings.
And Judy Shulman.
And Judy Shulman, there you go. You're married to one. She says that your most significant accomplishment is that you understand that teaching and teacher education are topics well suited for serious intellectual investigation. And you did this well before almost anybody else understood this. That AERA's Division K, Teaching and Teacher Education, is as large as it is, and the National Board as prominent, is a testimony to the presence of your insights and your research and your commitment to the field.
That's very kind.
What characteristics do you believe make for a strong teacher education program?
I think a strong teacher education program is a program that takes teaching very, very seriously. That that doesn't simplify it. I mean, I think that treats it as seriously as we treat the preparation of physicians or surgeons. Let's imagine that we had a very rigorous program for preparing surgeons, and someone came along and said, you know, the surgeon-patient interaction becomes enormously complicated when you have to treat patients coming from different cultural backgrounds and different language backgrounds. And unless future surgeons understand the complexities of that, they will not be able to treat people well, and therefore we have to add courses and experiences with non-native speakers of English, with different ethnic groups, to the preparation of a surgeon. That would be a very good idea, but you would never do it by saying, well, the time we have to prepare a surgeon is fixed. So let's remove 5 of the courses in the doing of surgery and replace them with these other 5 courses because we have to have a program committed to social justice. And I think to myself, just a second, we're all committed to social justice. But do we achieve social justice with a wider variety of ethnic and language groups by training physicians who will now be able to kill their patients at an equal rate, no matter what their cultural background? We can't relieve the standards in one place in order to meet standards that are terribly important in others. And one of the things I've seen is that as concern that reflects a real necessary reawakening or awakening for the first time of issues of social justice that involve teachers understanding more broadly the nuances, sometimes there's not nuances, the variations in background and language and values and orientation that kids bring with them to the classroom, and the need for us responsibly to teach students better. We need to understand and deal with that and respond to it proactively and sympathetically, and that the way we do that is not to spend less time with the teaching of mathematics or preparing teachers to teach higher order thinking or to, and I think that's what's happened is that teacher education programs, in my mind, have stopped taking teaching seriously enough. And as we become more cognizant of the social and cultural values that must accompany qualified teaching and effective and accomplished teaching, we somehow have fallen into, in too many teacher education programs, into the trap of thinking that if you have a socially and culturally conscious teacher, the other stuff will take care of itself. It won't. It absolutely won't. I am shocked at how little mathematics elementary school teachers still get away with. And then we wonder why the mathematics performance of our students gets worse and worse in international comparisons. And even more frightening, fewer and fewer of our students want to pursue careers in the STEM fields. Without immigration, and God bless immigration, we'd have no engineers and scientists left, or mathematicians. I mean, that's an overstatement. But, and yet, nobody suggests that maybe the problem is that we don't take teaching seriously enough. And we never permit a surgeon to get out there who doesn't exquisitely know anatomy or physiology or pathology, but we're letting teachers who we do ensure are socially conscious to go out and teach mathematics badly, to model negative, scared attitudes towards science. I mean, that's unconscionable. So I guess my definition of a good teacher education program is one that recognizes that justice is never achieved through equitable distribution of mediocrity. And true excellence is never achieved if the students who get it fastest do so on the backs of the kids who don't. But that it's like hydrogen and oxygen. You can't do with one of them. They're both there, or nothing's there. And I think we've lost sight of that in too many of our teacher ed programs. Teaching is hard.
Teaching is hard.
And it needs a lot of routine. The other mistake we've made is I know, and maybe I can take some responsibility, though I think it was around since Dewey, the notion that thinking that preparing a teacher is teacher education, not training. There's nothing training about teaching. Hell if there is not training. A great deal of teaching is routines, learning the routines, managing them, internalizing them. Some of the routines are domain general. Many of them have to do with management, making it a safe, civil, interactive environment. and many of them are domain specific. How do you do the homework check in mathematics for 4th grade? So it takes 5 minutes instead of 25.
Sure, sure.
So again, the emphasis on routine has got to be brought back as well.
Okay. For a decade, up until you left the position in 2008, you served as the president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. When you became president, you warned them that you had no administrative experience and had carefully avoided getting any. Tell us about your tenure there.
I wasn't lying to them. I had avoided being a department chair. I had avoided being a dean or an associate dean. Never did any of that work. I had directed the Institute for Research on Teaching, but that was not, I didn't have to worry about tenure and stuff like that. The answer is very, very simple. The answer is very simple. The job of a leader is not to manage. The job of an administrator is to minister. Mm-hmm. It is to create a culture where you surround yourself with the most talented people you can, and you create the conditions under which they do such good work that you just sit back and are enveloped by a feeling of joy at their accomplishment. When the search committee interviewed me for the job, they said, "What's your philosophy of management?" I told them it was all captured in a Yiddish word, naches. And that word is the Yiddish word for the joy you get out of the accomplishments of people you love, not of your own. And that included recognizing that the first hire I had to make was people who knew how to manage a foundation, how to run the foundation, the budget, and all that stuff. I hired the very best people I could, and then surrounded us with just a marvelous range of scholars and practitioners. And we had a real collaborative team effort and a culture in which people had naches from each other's work.